Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to give everybody else a couple more minutes to join us. So sit tight. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, and I think we can get started tonight. So welcome and thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's author, Patti Davis. She's here to discuss her book, Floating in the Deep End, How Caregivers Can See Beyond Alzheimer's. Floating in the Deep End details the challenges involved in taking care of someone who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, and provides hope for families struggling to understand the illness. Copies of the book are available for purchase at Hudson's independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. And we have a link in the chat for you to purchase the book on their website if you're interested in doing so. There will be time tonight for a Q&A with Patti, so please feel free to submit questions throughout the duration of tonight's program using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now to introduce our author, Patti Davis is not only an author, but she's also a journalist and screenwriter. She's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post and has written several works of both fiction and nonfiction. She's also the founder of Beyond Alzheimer's, which is a support group program for caregivers of people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And she's previously published a memoir detailing her experience with the disease entitled The Long Goodbye Memories of My Father. And with that, I will pass it over to her to get things started for the evening.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. So Floating in the Deep End really came about because of my support group, Beyond Alzheimer's. I started Beyond Alzheimer's in 2011. And the reason I started it was even years after my father had died, people would approach me with their own stories. Sometimes, you know, in the grocery store, if somebody recognized me. There are stories about their loved one with dementia. And it became so clear to me that there was not help or assistance out there for caregivers. There wasn't they weren't getting information from their doctors. And there was a real need for care for the caregivers. So at 3 o'clock in the morning one night, I woke up and I thought, I'm going to start a support group. And at 5, I was Googling Alzheimer's support groups in Los Angeles, and I didn't find many. So I thought, well, I'm going to do this. And there was never any doubt in my mind that I wanted to run it out of a hospital, which was amusing to people who know me because I have the worst white coat phobia of probably anybody. I mean, I have literally been known to get panic attacks when I've walked into a hospital to visit somebody. But I felt like people needed to be in the environment where they got this really scary, depressing, terrifying news and know that there was also help for them. And also, I wanted the medical establishment to step up and say to caregivers, hey, you know what? Here's this devastating thing that happened to you, but we're going to help you through it. So I went to UCLA, which was run by David Feinberg at the time, and who I dedicated Floating in the Deep End to. And he embraced the idea right out of the gate. And I ran it at UCLA twice a week for 5 years. Then there was an administrative change there, and that embrace kind of went away with David Feinberg. And once he left, it wasn't so embracing anymore. So I moved it to St. John's Hospital, ran it again for a year. And the structure of the group was that I had co-facilitators, sort of rotating on both nights. I ran the group both nights the whole 6 years, but I had co-facilitators from the medical field, because the other thing that I seen was that medical questions weren't being answered. And I couldn't answer them. And even frankly, if I could answer them or I knew the answers legally, I wasn't allowed to. So that's how I structured the group. And the other thing that was very important to me when I created the group was that I didn't want to just do a support group with, what do you do in certain situations? Although that's a big part of it, but I wanted to go a little deeper. And I would say to people in the support group, and I've written in Floating in the Deep End, before you ask, what should I do in this situation? Ask, who am I right now? Who is showing up right now? Because if you're still the resentful 17-year-old who's pissed off at your father for whatever, or the resentful 20-year-old or whatever, if you're going to bring your issues with your parents, it's usually parents, to that situation, it almost doesn't matter what you do, because you're going to be leading with that emotional reality. And don't think for a minute that people with dementia don't pick up on that emotional reality. In fact, they pick up on it more because they don't have the cognition to think analytically and to say, oh, okay, well, she's just still stuck in that, on that, episode that we had, or that, whatever, right? They don't have that. So all they get is the emotional tide that you're walking in with. So that was really important to me. And that's how I structured and ran the group. Then at the end of 6 years, I needed to make a change. I needed to get back to being an author. I'd only managed to publish one book in 6 years. I had 2 books that were novels that were started that I hadn't had a chance to finish. Also, 2016, well, we all remember kind of politically what happened in 2016. And when I wrote journalistic pieces, a lot of times I would get threats, including one that was serious enough that I had to contact the FBI. And I got really concerned that I was putting other people at risk, because anybody could come into the group. I mean, it was, advertised in the website. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take this to a different phase. And I'm going to license the group to hospitals. And I will only license it to hospitals. If someone wants to run it out of a church or something, I will encourage them to start some kind of support group, but it can't be this one. And I got 2 yeses. Geisinger, where David Feinberg had moved, said yes, and Cleveland Clinic in Las Vegas said yes. And I got a lot of no's from hospitals saying, oh, it's just not in our budget, even though the cost of running this group is, for a hospital, pocket change. And I thought, well, what I'm hearing when you say it's not in our budget is it's not in our area of care or concern. Like, we really don't care about the caregivers that much, which I kind of already knew. But I was sort of trying to introduce to you the idea that maybe you should care for the caregivers, because it's well known that caregiver stress is a very real thing. Statistically, doctors know this. They know that people who are caring for someone with dementia, those people are more likely than the person with dementia to have illnesses that are stress related, strokes, heart attacks, other things. The person with dementia doesn't have any stress. Every moment's new, right? So they might have a meltdown, but 15 minutes later, they don't remember that. The caregiver does 15 days later. So it's not that it's not known in the medical establishment. And so since I wasn't able at that point to fulfill my dream of having Beyond Alzheimer's be like the AA of support groups, I thought, okay, then you know what? I'm going to write a book about it, so that people, it was almost out of like anger and frustration that Floating in the Deep End came about. I thought, fine, if you won't let this be widespread, you hospitals, then I'm going to write about it and let people have a handbook that they can refer to. And that's really what this book is. It is, it's a guide through the disease, through all the situations that come up. There are things in there that doctors don't explain to people adequately, like the different types of dementia and what they entail. A friend of mine who is along with other friends, caring for a friend of his who was visibly having trouble. And they finally got her in for a diagnosis. And he called me up and he said, "Oh, I'm so relieved we got a diagnosis." He said, "She has Lewy body dementia." And I said, "I'm so sorry." And he said, "Well, but we have a diagnosis." And I said, "Did they tell you anything about Lewy body dementia?" And he said, "Well, no, I just know it's a type of dementia." So I told him some of the brutality of this disease and encouraged him to, Google it and read about it. But this is what happens to people. They get a diagnosis and they're not told what to expect. So I listed all of the different forms of dementia here, the characteristics, and in situations that come up, whether it's taking away the car keys or, when you should consider getting outside care, if that's at all possible for you. And this book is also part memoir, because if I'm going to give you advice on what to do in situations, you need to know how I came up with that. Otherwise, how do you know I know what I'm talking about, right? So that's how I ran my support group, and that's what I did in this book. And obviously my parents were fortunate enough to have outside care, but that doesn't mean, for anybody who's in that situation, that doesn't mean that you're not also a caregiver. Just because you're not doing the hands-on everyday work that an outside caregiver is, you're still emotionally a caregiver. You're the family. That caregiver can't give your loved one what you can give them. And so I hope in this book, and I think that I have communicated that as difficult as this journey is and as painful as it is more instructive than I think anything else in life can be, because it brings up everything. And that's sort of a main theme in this book, is that dementia strips away layers. It strips away the layers on the person who has it, the disease, and it strips away the layers of the people around, the family members around that person. And it lays bare everything. I had people in my support group complain that they were the ones stepping up to the plate to care for a parent, and their siblings were just gone with the wind, and I would say, well, how were things in years past? Well, yeah, they didn't really show up before, right? Because this is who they are. People are not going to change when a disease enters the picture. In fact, they're going to stay more rooted in who they are. It's going to become more accentuated. And it also strips you down to maybe that resentful 17-year-old, maybe that, maybe that person, that adolescent who has hung on to something for a really long time. I mean, I know when my father was diagnosed, one of my first thoughts was, I want to show up for this, and I want to show up fully for it, which means I have to grow up. I'd had a very long post-adolescence, and I'd hung on to a lot of resentments, and that weren't unjustified. I mean, I did not come from a close, cohesive family. That's just the reality of it. But I really wanted to show up for this experience and learn from it and grow from it, which meant that I had to grow up. And, if I didn't feel like a grown-up, then I had to act like one. There's that great thing in AA that they say, it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting, right? So if I felt like I was reverting back to, Patti 20 years ago or something, I would just act different. And then your emotions kind of catch up to that. So those are, these are the kind of things that I deal with in this book, both the emotional components and the factual components. How do you get the car keys away from somebody? This is a big problem. People don't want to give up we were so excited, when we got our driver's license and we could drive. Well, the flip side of that is it's devastating lose that, independence. And so there are techniques to do that, including having the car driven away and saying it was stolen. There are all sorts of creative ways, And in fact, also one other thing I'll mention is I have a whole chapter in this book on creative lying. And most of us have grown up with the idea that you never tell a lie and it's wrong to tell a lie. In the world of Alzheimer's, lying is your friend. If someone thinks that August is Christmas time, okay, bring them a Christmas gift, right? What's the harm? If they think that their dead relatives are still alive and are going to come visit them, make up a story of why they are not. I had someone in my support group who got so elaborate on the cruise, the ocean cruise that her mother's loved ones were on, this endless thing that, well, they're in Iceland and there's no cell service there, so they can't call. I mean, she just, she could have written a book about this cruise that these relatives were on. You don't want to say to someone that they're dead if they've forgotten, these people are dead if they've forgotten that they're dead, because then they have to grieve all over again, and they're going to forget. And then they have to grieve again. If you tell, it's going to be like Groundhog Day for grief, right? So lying is your friend. So it's, like I said, it's things like that. It's the emotional components and it's the factual things. And I tried to balance the two in this book.
Thank you so much for that. So we can move on, I guess, to the Q&A portion for tonight. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section using the button at the bottom of your screen. But to get this started, I wanted to ask, in the book, you talk a lot about how Alzheimer's taught you valuable lessons about life. And I wanted to know if there are any lessons that you have learned that you try to pass on to fellow caregivers.
Yeah, I would say the biggest one is to not decide ahead of time what an experience is going to be, how you're going to feel. A big one in Alzheimer's, and it's almost with everybody, a big one is when they forget my name, when they forget who I am. People use that as a marker for, well, I'll consider outside caregiving when they forget my name, or we'll talk about whether or not we should choose a facility when they forget my name. First of all, that's unrealistic, because they could be, lighting the house on fire by leaving the stove on and still remember your name. You don't know what sequence that this disease is going to take, or things are going to take in this disease. But also people hold that up as this devastating thing when it might not be. When I knew that my father didn't really remember that I was his daughter, it actually was a really beautiful moment. I'd suspected it before, but I knew one day when I was leaving my parents' house and I said, "Bye, Dad, I love you." And he looked kind of startled and he said, "Oh, thank you." He said, "Thank you very much." And I thought, okay, in this moment, I'm familiar to him because I'm coming up here to see him, but he doesn't remember in this moment that I'm his daughter. And I'm saying, "I love you." And he's saying, "Thank you." I just know in my own life, if someone who who wasn't related to me or close to me or something like that said, "I love you" to me, I don't know that I would say thank you, right? I think I might go, "What's wrong with you?" Right? So it showed me something very gracious and lovely about him. Also, usually what happens, not always, but usually, is that person might not remember that you're related to them. They might not remember your name, but they remember their heart remembers. They remember that they care about you. They remember that they love you. That emotion is still there. I do not believe that Alzheimer's can destroy what is in someone's heart. I just don't believe that.
So we have a couple questions coming in. Dina wanted to know, are there any programs or curricula in medical schools for doctors to learn how to work with families of Alzheimer's and dementia patients? She says that we found that often they had to explain why certain treatments were not suitable for their family member with the disease.
I'm sorry to sound cynical, but if there's any training in medical school, I haven't seen it. That said, obviously some doctors are more caring than other doctors. And I worked with, as co-facilitators, I worked with 2 or 3 neurologists, who were very caring and very wonderful. But they worked in hospital environments where one of them told me that she was told to get patients in and out in 20 minutes, even dementia patients. A dementia patient can take 20 minutes to say hello. How are you going to really, familiarize yourself with their situation in 20 minutes? You can't. So I don't think that there is enough training, hence the need for a support group for caregivers. I had somebody very recently tell me her husband has been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, and she called the doctor with a question, and the doctor said, "You can't keep calling me with questions. I don't have time to answer all these questions." Right? That's terrible. I mean, she's dealing with Lewy body dementia is terribly brutal, and that's what Robin Williams had. For a doctor to talk like that to somebody is horrible. And I wrote in Floating in the Deep End that sort of on my exit from UCLA, a very prominent doctor said to me, Alzheimer's is the least profitable area of medicine. And I don't think he's the only one who thinks like that. He might be the only one crass enough to say it, but, I haven't been overly impressed with what I've seen in the medical community.
Someone else is asking or telling their story and saying that their 70-year-old mother was diagnosed last week with dementia/Alzheimer's and was blindsided by the diagnosis, even though the family suspected that was the case. They were wondering how they could give her some emotional support and kind of help her to come to terms with her own diagnosis.
Her mother was the one who was blindsided.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the person who has gotten the diagnosis is going through the grieving process too. They've just been told that they're going to lose their memory, that this is going to be their exit from this life. They're grieving. So the first stage of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, 5 stages of grieving, the first one is denial. So you have to recognize that about your loved one, that they're going to usually go into a state of denial. And the best that you can do is nurture them through that and let them know that, don't try to soft pedal it. It's not going to be that bad. It's okay. You have, especially in the earlier stages, they can handle the truth. And they need to hear the truth because they already know it, right? And so, I know this is hard, and I know you don't want to believe this. None of us do, but we're going to be here for you, and we are going to help you through this no matter what comes up. I mean, that's the best that you can do, but recognize that they are going to go through their own stages of grief. The odd thing about this disease is that the worse it gets, the easier it gets in a way, because the person doesn't know anymore. At a certain stage, the person doesn't know anymore. They're not cognizant anymore that they are losing their cognition. So wherever they drift off to, usually they're okay there. They're pretty content there. And so it's sort of easier at that stage, which is not the same as with other diseases. Obviously, when other things get worse, they get worse, but this sort of gets a little bit easier. But I think you have to remember that this is a human being with a heart and a soul who has just been given a really hard diagnosis. And you need to not minimize their grief and their shock.
Right. Kind of along the lines of going through this process, someone's asking, putting a loved one in a facility can be really hard. So how would you address the guilt a person feels by needing to do this and take that step?
Okay. I write about this in Floating in the Deep End. The guilt is, and I've heard people say this, that they are abandoning someone by putting them in a facility. So here's my response to that. Abandoning someone is driving them out to the Mojave Desert, throwing them out of the car and leaving them there. Abandoning someone is not putting them in a facility where they will get 24/7 care, won't have the danger of wandering out and getting lost or burning the place down. And they'll be cared for by people who know how to do that, where the rest of us don't know how to do that. We weren't trained for this. People with dementia actually sort of thrive sometimes in the environment of a facility. First of all, it's organized time-wise. This is when breakfast is, this is where lunch is, this is when you get to sit there and watch a movie if they have that, The day is compartmentalized and organized, and that is really helpful for someone with dementia. And they end up in a community of people. They end up forming relationships, a lot of times romantic relationships, because someone with dementia goes back in time. So they might be 80 years old, but in their mind, they're 30, right? So they're going to want to date that person two rooms down, So they do develop other relationships with people. So the guilt is that you feel like you're abandoning them. But the truth of the matter is, it's very, very risky to keep someone at home. First of all, you don't have that kind of structured environment. Nobody has that in their home. As I said, we weren't trained to do this. I mean, my father stayed at home bedridden for the last 3 years of his life with round-the-clock nursing care. If someone can afford that, and it's a very personal decision, but there are some very caring and very good facilities now that didn't exist years ago. It didn't exist in the 90s when my father was diagnosed. So it is not something to feel guilty about.
Our next question comes from Glenn. He's wondering if you are a proponent of using markers or chips for dementia patients that wander.
Chips, like, what do you mean chips? Like you're going to microchip them like you do your dog or cat? Not like that, right? I'm not sure what that means.
I'm not sure either. Glenn, if you want to put in
I don't think you should microchip them.
Yeah, Glenn, if you want to put into the Q&A, give us some more context. That would be great. So we can move on. Hopefully it's not a microchip, but
I hope not. Please don't do that.
Kim is wondering, do you recommend going to a support group with the loved one who is in the early stage of the diagnosis?
No, absolutely not. No. You want an environment where you can talk about what you are going through. You don't want to talk about the stuff in front of them. I think I've heard that there are support groups strictly for people with dementia. I have no idea how that support group would work. I mean, because people with dementia repeat themselves all the time. So I have no idea how that one would work. But no, I mean, Beyond Alzheimer's was, and any caregiver support group is for the caregivers, so that you can talk openly and honestly about your loved one without them being there. That's really, really important.
Can you talk a little bit about, you did mention this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about grief and the grieving process as it relates to this particular disease?
Yeah, I've said to people, like when new people would come into the support group, I would say, or I or my co-facilitator would often say, how are you doing with your grief? And they would look at us like we were crazy. Well, my mother, my father, my spouse, whoever it is still here. They're not dead. And we would say that to make the point that the grieving process has to start now. I've called Alzheimer's a death before dying. That person is going to die to who you thought they were. They're going to die incrementally. As far as the person who you were familiar with, they're going to change. And your grieving process, you're going to be better served if you allow your grieving process to start at the beginning. We don't like grief. We don't want to go there. We feel like we will drown there. We feel like if we step into those waters, we'll drown there. And at moments you will feel like that. But if you allow yourself to walk into those waters, you will get to the other side. You won't drown there. Where you will get into trouble is if you try to resist that. And I told a story in Floating in the Deep End about a woman I met many years ago, way before my father was diagnosed, whose husband had cancer. And sorry, speaking of aging, my 16-year-old dog who has a bit of dementia just started walking somewhere. I don't know where she's going. He had cancer, and she set herself up as the sole caregiver, even though she could have afforded outside help, but she didn't. She, cared for him. And when he died, she got agoraphobia. She couldn't leave her house. And she was wise enough to know that she said to me, I didn't allow myself to grieve this whole time because I kept myself so busy. So she got agoraphobia. She had to sit there and deal with it. And that's what happens. I've said to people, and I wrote in this book, we like to think that we can push grief away. We'll like send it out to the South 40 or something, and it will just disintegrate there. But it doesn't work like that. Grief is not biodegradable. It will wait for you, and it will come find you. And if it has to come find you, it's going to bring you to your knees one way or another. An injury, an illness, in her case, not being able to leave her house. Something is going to happen because you're going to have to deal with it. So it's better to surrender to it at the beginning and go with it in all its stages and phases.
What are some of the things that you wish the general public understood about this disease?
Well, I wish they understood that there are a lot of colors on this palette. It's not just sadness and loss. There are gifts there. And I've written about that a lot. For one thing, you can get to know that person better than you ever did before with that stripping away process. People have found out things about their parent or even their spouse that they might never have known before, who they were before they were your parent or before you met your husband or wife. You can get insights into them. So, I think if you say, this is the worst disease ever, this is going to be the worst experience ever, then that's going to be your experience of the experience. If instead you take a step back and say, this is going to be a lot of things, and it's going to be sad and it's going to be painful, but I might also learn some things here and grow, and my heart can open in ways that it didn't before.
When speaking with someone in the early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, Christy wants to know if it's okay to use the phrase, "Do you remember when?"
When you're talking to someone with Alzheimer's,
Yes.
I would avoid that. I would avoid questions. And it's one of the things that we have to learn because it's just natural. It's natural for us to ask questions of people, but it triggers something in the person with Alzheimer's when they're being asked a question. It's like they're being put on the spot. So they have to come up with an answer. And particularly if it has to do with memory. If you want to steer them to a memory, then do it as a declarative sentence, right? Like 3 years ago, when we took that vacation to, I don't know, to the Hamptons or something, we did this and we went on that hike, or right? Paint a picture for them, but don't ask them to fill in the memory, because like I said, it puts them on the spot. And it's just sort of training. It's mental training for yourself to not ask questions. It feels unnatural, but you do it enough, you get the hang of it.
What would you say to someone who is hesitant about attending their first support group meeting?
Just go there and sit there and listen. I never forced anybody to talk. If someone came in and they didn't feel like talking at first, that's okay. Just sit there and listen. Hopefully, certainly my support was a very comfortable environment. And if it's not a comfortable environment, that's not the right group for you. So it should be really comfortable, but no one should be forced to talk. If someone wants to show up 2 or 3 times and not say a word, that's fine. Let them just listen. They're still going to gain things from hearing other people talk, right? So just, give it a try.
And kind of along those lines, what's some of the best advice that you give to caregivers?
Well, I think there's a lot of it in this book. I don't know what the best one would be. Well, I think, one of the first things that I said to myself when my father was diagnosed was that I didn't believe his soul could have Alzheimer's. So I was always trying, and that's why I called my group Beyond Alzheimer's. I wanted to encourage people to look beyond the disease. There's a soul in there that, in my belief, is intact and cannot be ill. And even if that doesn't comport with your spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs or something, just consider the possibility, because you don't know that it's not true. And what it will do is allow you to pick up on the moments of lucidity that come sometimes even deep into the disease. And they're very fleeting and they're very quick. And if you had decided that that person's just gone, you're not going to see them. You're not going to pick up on them.
Catherine wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about your process in working through your loss and about that kind of growing up that you spoke about. What was helpful for you during and after your father's passing?
Well, I think it starts with a decision. It starts with a decision. I'm going to grow up. And then, it's sort of catching yourself. As I said, who am I in this moment? Who's showing up here? Am I coming with an old agenda of, the girl who didn't get enough of her father's attention or something like that? This was, for me, much easier well, it wasn't easy, but it was easier to do with my father, much harder with my mother, because my mother was the one who triggered things in me. And, she was the challenging one for me. So that was much harder. And sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. But it starts with an intellectual decision, and and then you just know that it's kind of a pilgrim's path, that sometimes you're going to fall back and you're not going to get it right. That's okay. You still are working to that end.
Sure. Someone also mentioned that their father had Alzheimer's and he had what they're calling false memories, things that weren't really true, but were still nice and happy memories. They're
Right.
wondering if your father experienced anything like that.
Yeah, I told a story in Floating in the Deep End about when I moved to I was living in New York when my father was diagnosed, and for a while I was flying back to California to see him, and then I couldn't afford to do that anymore. So I moved back to California. But on one of those visits, I was talking to him about ice skating, that I'd taken up ice skating in New York, and I would go to Woolman Rink like every morning in the winter and ice skate. And he said something about, and my father ice skated when he was younger. And he said something about when he and I ice skated together. And I started to say, no, we never did. And I caught myself and I thought, well, if he thinks we did, what's the harm? So I painted this whole picture for him. Yeah, I know wasn't that a great day? And we were like in the forest and there were, the trees had icicles on them. And I just painted this whole picture for him. What's the harm? That's again, that creative line. What's the harm? If they think that it happened, go with it. You don't ever want to tell someone with dementia that they're wrong. You just don't.
Going back to when we were talking about asking people with dementia and Alzheimer's if they remember, someone wants to know, is it best just not to ask any kind of open-ended questions like that and just use those declarative statements, or can you ask yes or no, multiple choice kind of type questions instead?
Well, I mean, earlier on, multiple choice might not be bad. If they're still at a stage where you can like take them out to eat, say, you don't want to just give them the menu and say, you don't want to do that. So, in that case, like I said in the earlier stages, if you're still able to do that, pick 3 things, and list those, but just, or, it's easier even at the beginning to start training yourself and say the menu example, this sounds good. How about, let's get this. Doesn't that sound good? They might say no, and then you'll have to pick something else. But I think as soon as you can train yourself to stop asking questions, the better off you're going to be, because you're going to get it wrong sometimes. I mean, it's too natural when we're talking to one another to ask questions that you're not going to do it. But it's a training process.
Someone is asking, what can you do about the fear of watching your loved one, progressing in the disease and sort of getting worse over time, and their doctor being dismissive? Do you have any suggestions on how you can deal with that?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry about the doctors being dismissive, as we've talked about earlier. That just is a thing. I think it's really important to find somebody to talk to, hopefully somebody who has been through this experience. There are things that you can talk about that's the value of a support group, that you can talk to other people who are going through it about things that you really can't talk about with someone who has no familiarity with it, because they might have judgment, or, you have to be careful who you talk to. So I think it is important to get that kind of companionship. And listen, you know what? Fear is part of this. It just is, fear of death is part of this. And I think, I think the more that we kind of unravel our fears, not, if I would say to people sometimes, well, what are you most afraid of? A lot of times what would come up is, I'm afraid they won't remember my name. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's unravel that. Or, well, I'm afraid they're going to die. Well, okay, but we all are. Right? If you start like stripping that away, it's not just fear, it's a lot of other components in there that you can deal with and, make it a little bit more palatable.
Sort of along those lines, and as somebody progresses through the disease as the caregiver, it becomes a lot harder to take time for yourself. And this person is saying it seems more and more impossible as the disease progresses. And they were wondering if you had any thoughts or suggestions regarding, trying to take care of yourself as the caregiver.
Yeah, you have to. I've written a lot about this. You have to. For one thing, that is how caregivers stress, takes hold, is that you're not giving yourself time. And I understand that sometimes financially someone can't get, someone else to come in, but a lot of times there's respite care. A lot of times if you look at like the person's health insurance policy or even Medicare, certain, types of Medicare they have, that might, if you combine all of those, that might give you, I don't know, 4 hours a week or something of someone of care coming in to give you a break. But you need to do that. And a lot of times it's not financial. A lot of times people just feel guilty of, for taking time for themselves. And they feel like, they're supposed to sacrifice their life because their loved one has an illness, which again, if you take that apart and look at it, makes absolutely no sense at all. How are you sacrificing your life how is that going to help them? How is that going to make any difference? And why are you putting that kind of pressure? You didn't give them this illness. So why punish yourself and limit your own life because your loved one had the misfortune of getting an illness, plus which you're going to be a better caregiver if you do have your own life and you do take care of yourself. I give the example in the book, and I did in my support group, of when you're on a plane and they tell you if the oxygen masks drop and you're with a child or you're with someone who can't really take care of themselves, you put your own mask on first before you put the mask on them. You can't help someone else if you're fighting for breath. That's true with an oxygen mask, and it's true with dementia. You can't help them if if your life is so amputated at that point and so bereft of anything that all you're doing is, is your role as a caregiver. You need to have a life also. You need to give yourself sustenance, and you need a break sometimes.
Definitely. Christy is asking about a particular situation regarding pills, and how do you solve the problem of making sure your loved one is taking their pills when they need to, but them feeling like, oh, I know when I need to take them, or I can do it myself. How do you kind of get around this for their safety and making sure that
sometimes you just sort of have to put your foot down. You cannot leave a person with dementia with their own medications. I mean, you can start with, in the earlier stages, you can start with one of those pill boxes, and arrange the pills on each day, so these are the pills you know what I mean, in the little boxes with the days on. So you can start with that, but that's not sustainable, because at a certain point, they're not going to get that, right? So you can try to make it fun. You can try to make it a game, and the caregiver or somebody is going to give you your pills, and if they object to it, sometimes you just have to put your foot down and say, no, you know what, this is. I mean, I've said to people, in some situations they don't get a vote. That's just the fact of the matter. They don't get a vote. They have an illness. But you cannot leave someone with dementia with their own medications. That's just asking for a disaster, really.
Mm-hmm. Kim was wondering, do you have any recommendations on how to help guide children in dealing or speaking with a loved one that has dementia?
Yeah, I think you just be honest with them. Grandma or grandpa or whoever it is has a disease where they're going to forget things, and they're kind of going to forget where they are in their life. So sometimes they might think that they're much younger than they are. And that's just what this disease does. So meet them where they are. If they're acting like, think of it as a game, if they believe right then that they're back in college, play along with them, treat it like a make-believe game. I mean, kids are actually really good with people with dementia because it is like a game, right? They play make-believe all the time. So they're just playing make-believe with someone with dementia, right? It actually works out pretty well.
Can you talk a little bit about how music or art can be helpful in relating to Alzheimer's patients? And did you experience any of this with your father?
We didn't really use music a lot with my father. I don't know why. I didn't really hear about music therapy until I think close to when I started running my support group. So I don't know that it was really that well known until then. But this is a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's like music lives in a different part of the brain. So people with dementia relate to music when they can't relate to other things, right? I mean, Glenn Campbell's film was brilliant at showing that, as his dementia progressed, he could still get on stage and play the banjo and play the guitar and be brilliant at it. Tony Bennett, the same way, he did that 60 Minutes interview, and he gets on stage, he starts singing, he hears the music, he's there, but he can't tell you what he had for lunch. So music therapy is a big part of now with people with dementia. And it's usually the music that they like grew up with or related to in their younger years that sort of gets in there and anchors them. But I know in really good facilities, they use music therapy a lot. Art, I think, maybe in part the same thing. I know in a lot of daycare facilities, they have like, painting and stuff like that. And so I think anything creative that sort of bypasses the thinking brain is helpful, but music definitely is. It's very, very therapeutic. They've shown that.
Someone wants to know, do you have any thoughts on the use of certain medications, either memory drugs or psychotropic medications, when there are negative and dangerous kind of side effects? So you give the example of excessive hitting or something like that.
Yeah.
They want to know how that would impact the caregiver or the family involved.
Sometimes people with dementia get violent, and I know they have used and do use some drugs that inhibit those tendencies, and they seem to work pretty well. I mean, I have no objection to people using that, because you can't, first of all, you can't keep caregivers there if they're going to be hit and abused. I can't remember now the name of the most common drug that's used for that. I'm blanking out on it, but there is one that's typically used. And I think, you have to get the dosage right. You have to get the timing right. Like if someone sort of starts turning violent and upset at, say, at the end of the day, then you want to time the medication for the end of the day, things like that. I mean, that's something that you really need to work with a doctor on, but it can be helpful. I said earlier that generally speaking, people sort of drift off and they're okay there, but that doesn't always happen. And certainly in something like Lewy body dementia, that might not be the case, because it's can be a very volatile type of dementia. So it is, if that's the situation, it is absolutely something that you need to talk to your doctor about.
And just to end our program tonight, do you have any recommendations for caregivers in terms of resources, further, either articles, books, research materials that they can kind of look into to educate themselves about the disease and caregiving?
No, I don't. I think that, I think you can find a lot of things online. I mean, this is the second book I've written on Alzheimer's. I wrote The Long Goodbye as I was going through losing my father to Alzheimer's. So that was sort of more like in the moment. This is, obviously more therapeutic and after the fact and after realizing what I'd learned from the experience. But yeah, I don't, sorry. I don't have an Alzheimer's library here.
No problem at all. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to everyone else who tuned in tonight as well. I hope you guys all have a great evening, and thank you again, Patty, for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye-bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye. Bye.